Thank you for joining us today. For those that I haven't met before, I'm Dr. Julia Rafel-Bear. I'm the CEO and founder of Women Leading Ed. We are the largest national nonprofit network for women in educational leadership. Today's conversation is on a topic that I think goes completely undiscussed in education, and I think it's one of the, if not the most important levers that if we focused on, I think could dramatically upskill our workforce, and that's negotiation. I want to start by grounding in some reality. Our education workforce is dominated by women. Almost 80% of our education workforce are women, except only 30% of our leaders are women. That is a figure that has not changed for nearly a decade. There's also a glaring mismatch at the salary level. Women are making $20,000 to $25,000 less than their male colleagues at the district level. They make 12% less than their male colleagues at the state level. And in fact, there's 11 elected state superintendents, of which 8 of them are women, and they make 40% less than their counterparts. Every year, Women Leading Ed puts out an insight survey. We ask hundreds of women about what's on their minds. And for the last couple of years, we've seen some pretty remarkable trends. 8 out of 10 women report that they have never received training in negotiation. And in fact, only 1 in 20 women has had a career path that's emphasized finance, operations, big picture strategy. This is incredibly problematic when you think about the kinds of skill sets that's required to do the jobs that these leaders are doing every single day. And when you think about negotiation, it's not just about salary, although certainly salary is a big part of negotiation, but it's your everyday negotiation. It's how you advocate for resources, it's how you advocate for your team, and for leaders, it's about how you convince people that they should follow you. That kind of skill around negotiation is something that every leader needs to have as part of their skill set. And ultimately, that's why we're here today for this panel, Beyond Compromise. We're going to dig into some of what it takes to be able to train and to learn and to understand the skill set. We're going to talk about the role that men play in all of this, which is an incredibly crucial role in upskilling our workforce. And hopefully you'll leave with a set of new kinds of skills. I'm joined with 3 incredible leaders who have negotiated some of the most difficult challenges, but also have enormous track records in their results with students. We have Dr. LaTanya McDade, the superintendent of Prince William County Schools in Virginia, Dr. Susana Córdova, the Colorado State Commissioner of Education, and Alberto Carvalho, the superintendent of Los Angeles Unified School District. So we're going to dive in. First, our panelists all know, but I am a huge poker player. I started playing when I was in high school, I played in college, and then when I went to Cambridge University to do my PhD, I found out that there was a Monday Graduate Union Poker Society poker tournament every single Monday. I walked into that room and I had multiple men come up to me and ask me if I was lost. And I will tell you, by the end of that first night and every week after, nobody ever asked me if I was lost again when I made it to every final table there was. Thank you. Poker taught me a ton. It taught me about calculated risk-taking, decision-making. It made me comfortable with being in rooms that were dominated by men, and it also really helped me to hone my ability to read the room and to feel comfortable, all of the kinds of skills that matter so much in negotiation. Susana, we are certainly not at a poker table, but you are no stranger to very high stakes tables. You have negotiated in some of the hardest challenges and out in front in negotiations that are required by law to be public. Tell us a little bit about how you've thought about negotiation and how you've trained yourself for the kinds of moments that you've been in your career.
Yeah, thanks, Julia, and thanks for the chance to talk about this. One of the very first classes I took when I moved into the central office was a class on negotiating for women. It was an incredibly powerful course to learn about, when do you open first? When do you open second? How do you think about risk-taking? And ultimately, I think at the heart of negotiation is knowing what are you willing to compromise on, what are you not willing to compromise on, and how do you make the decisions about when to make those moves. And certainly one of the things that I can point to is when we were negotiating a union contract, one of the things that we were deeply invested in was paying people more to teach in the schools that were highest poverty. And that was a hill we decided we were just going to die on. And in fact, it was such an important thing to us that as the union was pushing back on lowering the stipends, we actually came back with raising the stipends. And we gave up on a bunch of other places, but that was a place where we were like, nope, not only is this the most important thing to us, it's so important that we're gonna up the ante, not lower it. And that was a really powerful move. I think it sent a really important message to the entire community, most of whom were on the side of teachers. But it's really hard to argue against the moral high ground of this is in the best interest of students, and we're not gonna compromise on it.
LaTanya, I want to bring you into this. You have been in some pretty serious negotiations. You oversaw all of the schools in Chicago public schools, and you sort of did both the big P and the little p. You had the big P politics of having to do these negotiations, and then also having to get up in front of the media, sometimes in the wee hours of the morning, and try to explain to people what really went on. And then you decided to do something incredibly brave. You left a system that you were at the top of and decided to go become the superintendent out in Virginia, Prince William County, where you became the first. You were the first non-white male to lead that system, and all of a sudden that brings in the little p politics, an organization that had literally never had anyone who looks like you leading them. You heard the stats about the Insight survey and sort of what's happening for women everywhere, and I'd love for your just reflections on your own career path. How did you end up getting the kind of exposure that you did, and how have you learned lessons about the differences in how women are moved up and provided skills or not in these systems, and what can we do about it?
Yeah, first, I think it's first important to address the fact that there are social constructs and cultural norms. Can you guys hear me? Can you hear me? Okay. You guys, you okay? All right. I think first it's important to address the fact that there are social constructs and cultural norms within our society, right? Not objective reality, but shared beliefs about how women show up or should show up. And what we know to be true, and there's a wealth of research on this, is that women shy away from being assertive, not because they can't be, but because often it's frowned upon. So if you have a woman who is assertive, she's aggressive, she's abrasive, she's bristly. Now the new word is challenging, right? So but on the flip side of that, if a man is assertive or even outright aggressive, it's seen as a positive, like that's strong leadership, that's the type of person we want in the room. And so we can't ignore the way that society plays a role in how we show up. Because of that, oftentimes as women, we come into a room with a fear of not wanting to be seen as the person who's abrasive or off-putting or the person that's challenging to work with. And so we are encouraged to be collaborators and consensus makers and peacemakers and not be assertive. And so that's the big problem. Because of that, oftentimes we don't acquire or build the muscle for negotiation that we need to build. One of the couple of ways that I've approached this, because I think since I was 10, okay, I grew up with all boys, and I've always been what people would say is intense, because you know people find these cute little ways to say that you're something that I probably can't say in public, but we know the drill, right? I've always been that way, and I've gotten the feedback of, oh, that you know sometimes you're intense. And I'm thinking to myself, get out of here, look at what he just said, you know, but we can't say that. There was even a study that was done that the Harvard Gazette published, and it was looking at, even in the classroom, right? There were students in the medical profession, they were in class, and what the study showed was the assertiveness gap in the classroom for medical students, where the male students were assertive in the classroom in discourse, and the female students almost asked for permission. Before they would assert anything, they would say, well, I'm sorry to interrupt, or maybe I missed this. No, you didn't miss it, they didn't say it, so say it. So that's what we do because we don't want to come off a certain way. And what ended up happening in that study is their grade was impacted for it, right? So what I have learned in my time in leadership that led to me managing a $3.4 billion budget as the Chief Education Officer in CPS and negotiating a $1.5 billion contract, 5-year contract, which was an unprecedented contract with the CTU, is that, one, we have to learn how to become debate makers. So in your respective roles today, you can start to learn to build that muscle by embracing, even if you don't want to step out and be assertive, you can be a debate maker. Right? If you're in a room full of men and everybody's got all the great ideas, but really yours the best, and you don't want to be the person that comes off as if, you know, you're asserting yourself in a way that can be off-putting, learn how to be a debate maker, be curious, ask the tough questions. So what has worked well for me in a room is I will pick so many holes into the ideas that are on the table, then people are asking me, LaTanya, what do you think? Because they can't even answer the questions, right? So learn how to be the debate maker where you're being curious enough to posit the kinds of questions that will ignite the kind of debate that allows you to jump in and be assertive in the discussion. That's a small way to be able to get in. But the other part about that is relationship building. So when I became the Chief Education Officer, what I did was I built a strong relationship with our CFO, who was a male, our COO, who was a male, right? Our Chief Human Resource Officer, who was a male, and learned so much about the different operational aspects that would help me then to use that in navigating my position as the Chief Education Officer, because too often women in ed leadership are pushed into the instructional curriculum roles. We're not pushed into the other roles. And so those are some of the things that I've done to navigate the space and to build up my negotiation muscle, but you have to be in it and practice it in order to be able to do it. And I'll end on what Julia talked about in terms of negotiation. It's not always about being assertive. Sometimes it's about being listening and being silent, because silence is powerful as well. Reading the room, knowing when to assert yourself, knowing when to listen, and also knowing when to pivot and when the fight is not your fight and leaving it to someone else. And if you have to build those negotiation skills to experience both personal and professional long-term impact and success in your career as a woman in educational leadership.
Alberto, I'd love to hear from you a little bit on this now. So you have done an incredible job now leading in 2 of the largest systems there are. You completely turned around Miami as the superintendent there. You are known in your role both in LA and in Miami as negotiating some of the best contracts, stuff people had never even heard of, getting royalties for your district, and really being totally willing to walk away from some pretty high stakes negotiations and often. But even more than that, what you're known for is the way that you have developed so many women of color underneath you, who you give that kind of exposure to and who are learning from you directly. And I'd love if you just share a little bit about your own career journey in feeling comfortable on negotiation, and then how you intentionally create the space for real high-performing women to get the kind of exposure and learning alongside you in all of this.
Thanks, Julia. Good morning, everyone. So let me begin by describing, from my perspective, the different dimensions of negotiations, right? And I see it as really encompassing 4 different buckets. Number 1, personal negotiation. And that's the fundamental negotiation you have between your heart and your mind. What are my values? What am I willing to compromise on? What do I believe? What are the things I will never do? And what are those things that I can give away easily? Meaning, how do I create common ground easily with individuals or with groups? That's personal negotiation. It's an internal negotiation with self. A lot of people jump into external negotiation without really understanding who they are. Therefore, they run out of gas. At some point, they're in a position where they struggle with deciding whether or not they're okay with the situation because they really have not asked the tough questions of themselves. Second level of negotiation is one that I think my colleague spoke about, is negotiating with entities such as labor unions and associations. Those are usually some of the toughest types of negotiations, obviously, right? Because you're speaking and negotiating, trading issues with an entity that, no matter what you do, may already have a pre-existing perspective or strategy that will automatically vilify you because it's good for the membership. So in those instances, obviously the perfection or the perfecting of the skill set to know what's appropriate, what's okay, how far you can go, what can you afford, but the most important, what's your BATNA, the best alternative to a negotiated agreement. If you fail to be able to get that, what is the fallback to position that it's still okay, right? And last but not least, in the realm of negotiation is what is the one element, the one thing, the one concept, the one premise where both parties walk away feeling that neither one of us got everything we wanted, neither one of us lost everything. The third level of negotiation is the negotiation with policy entities. So your state, local, federal entities, no doubt. And some people don't look at this as negotiation, they look at it as lobbying or advocacy. But lobbying and advocacy is negotiation. And it is often ignored. That's when you need to really understand law, policy, practice, understand your institution's values, not only your own, and then understand the other party's position, particularly now, right? It is very clear. If you're going to go to Washington to advocate for a position, you better know which doors will be locked just on the basis of who you are, where you come from. Very, very tough. Usually, this level of negotiation is historically not as tough as labor negotiations, but I believe that in 2025, it will be exceedingly difficult, particularly for districts in blue states, urban districts, even if they're in red states. And then the fourth level of negotiation, often ignored, and I'm speaking directly to the membership here today, is the negotiation for self-benefit. Aside from the introspective negotiation, defining our own values, what we stand for, what we will not accept, is when I am seeking a position, what is going to be my posture? What is my strategy to advance my own position in this realm, whether it's seeking a superintendency, a C-level executive position in the private or public sector, right? What are the comps for salary and benefits? How many years of contract should I be asking for? What are the non-negotiables for me? What are my demands? A lot of people go into that field without really writing down what they would accept and what they would not accept. Now that I laid out what I believe are the four levels of negotiation, I believe one of the reasons I think you invited me as the only guy on the panel is because I have led districts through transformation, aggressive transformation that was largely driven by absolutely stellar, best-in-kind female talent that was better than male talent. Because I had, I believe, the intellectual honesty of looking at talent, period, raw talent, but also creating opportunities for talent that had not yet been developed to compete for a certain position, to gain the experiences so that at some point there would be competitors in that space. I'll give you two very quick examples. Miami-Dade, my head of HR, my lead negotiator with labor, my head of intergovernmental affairs, my CFO, at one point my chief facilities officer, they were all women. My chief academic officer, which is usually the position that women default to, I actually had it on the other side. Positions that across the country are mainly dominated by men. In Los Angeles, the same thing, plus. So again, my head of HR, head of labor negotiations, my head of facilities running, we just approved a $9 billion bond. You know, she did it. My head of intergovernmental affairs, my chief strategy officer, my chief of staff. I think I'm going to run out of chiefs before I run out of women in my organization. And the reason is a simple one. Number one, we created pathways. We created stages that scaffolded into this level of competence that women would be prepared for and would navigate well. The last thing I will say, reflecting on my own journey, maybe, you know, I grew up in a family of 6 in abject poverty. I had only one sister. And my 4 brothers said a lot, honestly, they were typical boys. Said a lot, but did little. My sister was more reserved in what she said, but did a lot. And I think I learned more from her than from them. She also was the strongest believer in me than they were. They were competitive with me. She believed in me, and she enabled me. And she also called me out when I was wrong in a very kind and compassionate way. And I think when you surround yourself with people like the entities in my cabinet level that I just described, then success is inevitable. You know, they're able to translate or transition from the impossible to the inevitable very, very quickly because they have equal parts belief, skill, and will. I believe the female administrator is actually stronger. They possess equal level of intellectual ability, but from my experience, higher level of EQ. Higher level of EQ, more empathy. They're able to make connections in terms of practice based on impact before the theory is applied. They know this may not work out because people think in a certain way or they will interpret it a certain way. So it has served the work well, as you mentioned, and the results that we have delivered, whether in Miami and now in LA, they're building. And as I said, largely driven by incredibly talented teams of administrators who happen to be women. But as I say happen to, it didn't have to happen because the talent is there, right? As we often say, talent is equally distributed, opportunity is not. If you never create the opportunity, the talent never surfaces. It doesn't mean it doesn't exist, you just don't see it. And if you don't see it, you don't get it picked up. So second level, very, very quickly, 30 seconds, is if they've done well by you, how do you position them for the world beyond your organization? And that's where, unfortunately, I lose control. And I've come across a number of instances where the best superintendent for districts who resided in my district was not selected. And that's shameful. So I've created internal changes that have leveraged the power of female leadership, but that has not necessarily translated beyond the systems that I've led because the world has not caught up to that level, unfortunately.
LaTanya, I want to build on some of what Alberto was just sharing and some of what you had mentioned before, this idea that women so often end up in the academic and sort of teaching and learning pathways. And given what I shared at the start about the fact that 1 in 20 women in our survey had any experience in finance, in operations, and big picture strategy, just curious your reflections on both why this is happening and then what we could be doing to really start to provide women with more of these opportunities earlier on.
Yeah. And I think the earlier on part is the key. I mean, even starting young, like in the classroom or in early career, on any given Monday, I can walk into an AP Calc class and who's in there? It's all boys, right? So women aren't being encouraged to go into these leadership roles. And it's not just, as Alberto talked about, like not having control beyond his organization, it's not just in ed leadership, it's happening across all sectors. The Deloitte Center for Financial Services put out data from 2019 that showed that only 6 out of 107 of the largest financial institutions were led by a woman CEO in the United States. And even in 2024, that number is a mere 10.2%, which equates to about 52 women CEOs in your Fortune 500 companies, right? Now, just like in the teaching profession, the classroom teacher is predominantly women, and Julia just gave the numbers and the statistics in terms of the top spot is barely 30%. That's the same thing when you look at the business schools, the Harvard Business School, Wharton Business School, there's parity in the number of women and men that are actually in business school, but by the time you get to that C-suite, that number diminishes significantly. And so women are just not being encouraged to go into those roles, and we're seeing that in educational leadership because what ends up happening in a superintendent search is the board is looking for someone who has a strong financial, operational management background, right? And then they hire the guy that has that, and what does the guy do? He hires a CAO, that's a woman. And then what happens in the organization, if they're not doing things like what you heard from Alberto, where there's leadership development, then the women are only pushed into those instructional roles, and then the height is the CAO, because when it's time to go to be a superintendent, and I've seen too many of my mentees, my own mentees that I mentor, I'm looking at their resumes and I'm like, you have nothing in here on budget. You have nothing in here on operations, but you've done all these things. right? And so the feedback from boards is typically, well, you know, we don't think that you have enough experience managing a budget this size. And so what needs to happen in organizations is that we have to build leadership development pathways so that women can go into different roles that are not just leading to the academic side. And even if they are in academic roles, opening up access to opportunities and experiences that allows them to gain the necessary experience in operations and budget, so that when they do go for a superintendency, they're well-rounded. And that's exactly what happened with me, right? I held all instructional roles. However, when I did get to be the teaching and learning officer or the chief education officer, then I built those strategic relationships. So with my CFO, when it was time for budget, like I literally sat with him days and days and days and learned everything budget, right? And so not just the things I needed to know to run my own budget. Same thing held true with operations, right? I led the negotiation of a $300 million digital equity curriculum contract and had to present that to the board. Now, I could have, as the chief education officer said, delegate that to somebody else on the finance team. But I chose to do that myself because that allowed me to get out of my comfort zone and build the muscle for being able to negotiate around financial and operational aspects of the work that I never before had access to, right? So what I've done in building on my own experience and reflecting on that, I did have male allies and strategic relationships that I was able to build to help develop my skill set, but that's not always the case, and there's not always an ally. And so institutions have to create that space. So I opened up a talent management department, which we've never had in our organization. And that talent management department's responsibility is to have a framework so that everyone in the organization can see exactly what the pathway is to different roles that they might want to seek out, and then also provide the training that goes with that, right? Because I want people in the organization to see that we don't just value the skill set you have today, we want to build your leadership capacity for the skills that you want to possess and the positions you want to be in tomorrow. So that was the first thing I did. The second thing that I've done is completely revamped our hiring practices. So now for any executive level position that comes to me, they cannot just bring to me, here are the finalists. I need a memo that lays out, disaggregates the data and shows exactly how many applicants were female, how many applicants were male, especially for these positions that are not instructional, right? Because we already know there's research on this as well. If you don't even have the number of applications that are representative of female, the likelihood of a female going into that role continuously decreases. So we changed our hiring practices for that. We've done training on implicit bias and stereotyping, but they already know that it's got to be a 50-50. If there's an associate superintendent position that's vacant and you bring me finalists and I look at the data and it was 30 male applicants and only 5 female applicants, I'm not looking at the finalists. You got to go back to the board and do some recruitment. And they know that. They know they can't bring that to me because I cannot, in living my core values as a woman in leadership and everything that I've experienced, run an organization where we're not valuing women going into the roles that they are absolutely qualified for and worthy to be in. So but that has to be intentional, and you have to put those systems in place to do that. So those are some of the things that I've done, but I will say to each of you, regardless of whatever role that you're in, when you think about what you want to aspire to, think outside of the traditional track that you've always saw yourself in, and then seek out those opportunities to grow your own knowledge and skill set. And that doesn't always have to be that your organization has some type of class for you to go to. Sometimes it's being like me, sitting down with our CFO and saying, hey, help me understand this budget. I want to know when the money comes in. I want to know when it goes out. I want to know what percentage is local, what percentage is federal, what percentage is state. Like just asking those questions and learning and fact-finding for yourself, and knowing that you have the capabilities to take on roles outside of the traditional instructional track. But you have to seek that out and be willing to get out of your comfort zone. I'll leave you with this. This is what I say to people all the time in this position that I'm in. I have learned how to be comfortable with being uncomfortable.
Susana, you have led at every level of the system. You have done an incredible job. You've been a teacher, you've been a principal, you've been a district administrator, deputy superintendent, interim superintendent, superintendent, and now commissioner. You've also worked for some pretty incredible leaders who've had long stay in power and who also were incredibly focused on outcomes. Tom Boasberg, Michael Hinojosa. You've seen a lot, and I'm curious from your perspective as you think about your own growth and then what you've observed with women on your team and then what you've observed from working with such strong men focused on outcomes. What's been some of the differences? How do men and women approach negotiation differently from your perspective? And what do you think we can learn from this as we're moving forward?
Sure. I think that there are some, maybe typical characteristics that you can think about that are female-oriented versus male-oriented. We've talked a little bit already about how men can be more aggressive without being called aggressive, just, like savvy or astute, whereas women get pegged with many of the labels that we just talked about. I think some of the mistakes that women make, frankly, are undervaluing their worth. I think women frequently are connected to the place and less willing to move. And so if you are tied to a place, you may be less willing to negotiate hard or walk away from what you want. And I think, frankly, women just, on the face of it, frequently ask for far less, or are much more willing to take what they're offered and don't actually know what their value is. I remember the first big job I had in my hometown with a boss I really liked who offered me a salary, and I left the room. I just did like a really quick Google search, and it was like $40,000 less than every surrounding district in my state. We're the largest district. We were the most urban district, and it was like, maybe as a high poverty, we want to put money where we need to put money, maybe a little bit less than higher paying suburban districts, but $40,000 less? I don't think so. And so I actually went back and I was just like, here's what other people are getting paid, and here is what you offered me. Like, I can't do this. And you need to be able to do that kind of research and know, like, all salaries are public, and so you need to do that research. You need to be able to be clear on what you are willing to take and what you are not willing to take. I took a pay cut to become the Commissioner of Education. I was willing to do that, but I made it known. You need to understand I am doing this because I want to, and I'm taking a pay cut in how I'm doing this. There's not a lot of negotiating in states for state departments of education. And I just made it known, like, this is as low as I will go because I'm leaving money on the table. And at the end of the day, I have a family. I have things that I want to make sure that I can do and take care of, and I need to make that a part of the calculus about am I willing to do something or not. And I think women have a much harder time being able to do that. And frankly, I think sometimes it's the voice in our own head that is censoring us. If you don't see models of how to do that, if you don't have colleagues, part of the reason why I remember really clearly, part of the reason why I did that Google search was I happened to have a meeting that afternoon with a person that I just sort of knew. And she was like, well, you need to go back in and negotiate. Like, check it out. And if she hadn't done that, it was probably the second time I'd ever talked to her. If she hadn't done that, I don't know if I would have done that. And so just the power of having another person talk with you about how to approach a negotiation makes a huge difference. So if you are not doing that for other women, you should be. And I frequently, particularly with young women, will say, I'm going to wear my hat right now where I'm going to be your boss. And I'm taking that off, and I'm going to tell you what you need to do and what you need to advocate for. Because if you don't have people doing that for you, if you don't have models, you don't ever learn how to do that.
Alberto, I want to bring you into this. Your skill set obviously has had to develop over time, and to be able to do things at the level of billions of dollars that you're negotiating takes a lot of skill development. How did your skills develop in all of this? Who taught you what you know? And as you think about and reflect on this conversation, how do we do this earlier for more leaders? What's some of the lessons from your own experience?
Yeah, I think that's actually a very good question. But before I answer, I'm just curious as to who's listening to us right now. If you're a classroom teacher or any responsibility in the school, but not administrative, can you raise your hands? Okay. If you have an administrative responsibility anywhere in the school district, can you raise your hands? If you're a representative of the private sector, can you raise your hands? If you just made a mistake and landed in this conference, because there's a lot of people left. I don't know what else to ask for. The reason nonprofit, philanthropy, and all that. Great. That's quite a bit. Government. Yeah, those are not popular these days. Like me. So terrific question. So I have to admit, I'm a non-traditional educator. I was never trained as an educator. I have degrees in biomedical sciences and physics, then business. And I stumbled upon education because I thought I was going to be a medical doctor, and gross anatomy was basically gross. So I did something else. I said, you know what? There was a lack of teachers, particularly advanced mathematics and science, and I was in Miami. And first interview I went for, they needed somebody who would teach calculus, chemistry, and physics, AP. And I thought, I was the lucky guy. Then I didn't realize that every high school in Miami could have hired me because they needed that kind of person. But I selected a school that was in inner city, extreme poverty, a huge percentage of students who were English language learners, high percentage of students with disabilities, and that school was not well resourced. And that's really what hooked me into education to begin with, was the very, very obvious level of disparity between schools. And I knew very quickly that as a classroom teacher, and I think I did well, you had an impact, but that impact would not change the school. Just as a classroom teacher, certainly would not change a district or the community. So I sought additional knowledge specific to budget and finance and negotiation. So I enrolled in a number of courses, particularly through Harvard University, on the art of negotiation. I sought leaders within my own district that I felt possessed skill sets that I needed to enhance. And I volunteered myself as an intern in their office when the system was down in the summer or whatever it was. I volunteered for every single committee of interest that I believed would enhance my skill set. Put myself out there, right? And then I was very careful in terms of not just accepting positions because they were available and I knew I could get them. I really measured my time to land the positions that I absolutely wanted. By the way, in negotiations, it's not just about going for what you can get. That's a grab, right? That's easy. As you mentioned earlier, she was alluding to the fact that, in my mind, I always wanted to be superintendent in the number 1, 2, and 3 districts in the country. As an immigrant to this country, we had nothing, first in New York, once homeless. I wanted to be that guy, right? I want to be superintendent in New York City, chancellor, superintendent in Miami, superintendent in Los Angeles. I got 2 or 3, but I was appointed to chancellor of New York City. However, even after the negotiation is over, it's never over. There's always a reopener. And the reopener may actually be an honest endeavor, or it could be dishonest. And the person I was negotiating with at that time, for Chancellor of New York, decided to change the rules of engagement last minute. Basically said, I want you as chancellor, need to improve NAEP scores for the students, need to improve Black student achievement, need to reduce the achievement gap, need to negotiate the contracts, needs to get a construction program in place and activate it very quickly. But I need you can do whatever you want, you're going to have the latitude, but I need you to hire this person who's been with me since my campaign as the head of HR. And this person who's in the mayor's office needs to become your chief of staff. And by the way, you need to give a side job to the current chancellor. And I told him, Mr. Mayor, let me call you back. That is a time to pivot your negotiation. Even if you accept it, it's never too late to say, stop, I can't do this. Do not accept the position just because it was easy to get, if in the end it's not going to serve you well, right? So I sought, to directly answer your question, answers for every skill deficit that I felt I had. And I looked for the master teacher to teach me that, usually through embedded experiences. In the summer as a teacher, working as a summer school assistant principal, asking to be an intern in the budget office to master. I had, principles of accounting and business down, but school finance was different, right? Then I sought a very, very elderly, father of the Florida education funding formula. I wanted him to teach me Florida funding for education. And then I started going to DC with Council of Great City Schools. I was showing up for meetings I was not invited to learn about federal policy, appropriations, IDA, Title I. How does it work? How do these appropriations work? How do we leverage that knowledge to increase resource attainment? So that was my journey. And by the way, you should never be done, meaning the learning process is forever, because policy is always changing. Priorities change, appropriation styles change, and the appropriators change, right? Union leaders change. So continuing to perfect your skill set, now I do it in a different way. I teach at the university level, and that's my reverse learning, because I'm learning now from international students, from superintendents who are getting their doctorate degrees. I'm learning from individuals who bring in expertise and different perspectives. That's how I reinforce what I know and pivot and recalibrate on the basis of today's reality. So it's been a learning experience, usually driven by myself, first recognizing what am I lacking and seeking the master teacher to teach me, the shadow, the mentoring, and the internship for me to learn by doing, which I think anyone here would agree is the best way to actually perfect the skill. And by the way, not being afraid to fail as well. It's okay to go for something and not get it, because that too is a learning experience.
I want to build off this last point about failure. One of the things that I really appreciate about poker is that it really teaches you how to deal with tough beats. You can have the best hand, you can know your probability, you can read your opponent, you can do everything in your power that is right, and then you can still lose. And those bad beats are tough. It's tough enough if it's the final hand and you're out, but it is even worse if you have to keep going. And if your opponents now know something about what you've just shared, it's tough to learn to recover from. All three of you have had to learn how to deal with tough beats. Maybe you've been in a negotiation at the last minute, the mayor swoops in and changes the terms, the governor swoops in, or just frankly, the rules of engagement along the way don't feel right anymore for what you were negotiating. I'd love to hear from each of you about a story around a bad beat moment and how you learned to recover, and what advice you have for people about recovery and about getting to that level of resilience in these kinds of negotiation moments. Alberto, maybe we could start with you.
My God, I hope you have until 5 o'clock. Because there have been a lot of failures, a lot of times when the win was just not there. Unlike poker, because poker does require skill, but also requires a degree of luck, right? You got to play the cards you dealt. In what we do, luck is not necessarily something you should try to score aggressively on. Really understanding your craft, understanding best practices, surrounding yourself with best thinkers and doers, and doing what's right. And that to me is that personal negotiation is I'm not going to do something wrong. I'm going to do what's right. That eliminates a lot of possibilities, right? Meaning don't take shortcuts. But reflecting on real challenging circumstances where I felt that we, at least at the beginning, failed, right? The recent, negotiating the recent events in Los Angeles with fires. Here I was depending, as a superintendent of the second largest school district in the country, with an annual budget of $20 billion, 75,000 employees and 600,000 students. The fires were happening simultaneously in different parts of the community, but not necessarily directly threatening huge numbers of our schools. We have 1,000 schools, huge district. We knew that Palisades fire, if you recall from the news, Palisades and Altadena, Pasadena. One is out west by the water, Malibu, Santa Monica for reference, and the other one, Pasadena. So you're talking about farther south and east. The Palisades fire actually impacted schools. We lost 3 of our schools to the fire. But everybody was evacuated on a timely basis. We had evacuated those schools, and the entire neighborhoods had been evacuated in many instances, hours, if not days, in advance. But the Eaton fire, which was the Altadena fire, even though Pasadena is not my district, that fire produced smoke that, based on prevailing winds, flooded the entire jurisdiction with thick plumes of smoke, ash, particulate matter. I was depending on the county's emergency system, which provided air quality indices that I later discovered were flawed. As I was driving to work, we had evacuated about 200 schools on the eastern band of the district, closest to the fire, but those fast-moving winds overwhelmed the system. And we were getting wrong readings. And we actually sent people to school in about 800 schools into conditions that were not appropriate, because we were relying on systems that were built to deal with one fire without necessarily hurricane strength winds, not 3, 4, 5, 6 simultaneous fires with high wind speeds in a topography, right, of cliffs, valleys, gullies, canyons, where the smoke can linger for a long period of time. And I talk about this in a spirit of negotiation because I was negotiating information with the mayor, with county supervisors, with first responders, with my own team. And we thought we were being driven by science and data, when in reality, common sense at that point should have dominated. And at one point, I forced myself, ignore the data. It is clear it is flawed. Use your common sense. Follow your instinct on the basis of what you can see, what you can smell, what you can feel. By the way, very important in negotiations. Don't just go on the basis of what's proffered across the table. Don't, we as human beings, we discern things. We have intuition. And picking up on the nuances, just like in poker, is important. Sometimes it's not the card, it's the disposition. And in negotiations, sometimes it's not the cards you have, how much money you have, it's a disposition. So we failed initially in negotiating that moment, even negotiating with the unions who were clamoring for an immediate shutdown. But you know what? As a leader, be honest. Recognize that mistakes were made. But then don't linger in that pity pool of nothing. Get out of it and pivot, recalibrate on the basis of what you know. And we made a significantly different decision to shut down all schools, stop relying on the data systems that were flawed, deploy people as observers in different areas to provide old-fashioned information about conditions in those areas, and then bring back the unions and make good. What was good? Anyone who lost a home, $10,000 grant, 10 days off from the school system. Anyone who was evacuated, $1,000 grant, 5 days off from the school system. That's a way of rectifying, right, something that did not go well. The second example, very, very quickly, I think it's part of the ritual of going to LA. I came from a right-to-work state, Florida, cannot strike. LA, different state, different policy, right? And I arrived there, and just a short time after, there was a strike, a 3-day strike. Not a teacher-led strike, actually support personnel. And I really tried hard to understand. I'm trying not to take things personal. You cannot be a superintendent and have thin skin. But I really couldn't come up with why, until I looked at the history of Los Angeles, and I figured out that this is not about me. This is about justice. And you have individuals who are working one of the costliest areas in the country, working below poverty level wages. And how can we reconcile that? So, lesson learned. We went into impasse, went into a strike that lasted 3 days, but 24-hour negotiation cycles, no sleep, a lot of coffee, until we realized, is it a risk? Yes. But it was important for us to recalibrate, change our approach, which led then to a 30% increase for support staff, largest increase ever in the country, for your custodial staff, for your bus driver, et cetera. A 21% increase for teachers in one full swoop over 2 years. That attempted to rectify historical wrongs that were manifested to me because I'm the new guy who now has the responsibility, right? Even though I didn't create the conditions, I'm the person who has the position, which is a lesson learned, right? It may not be your fault, but you're in the seat, and that seat carries history. So it may not be personal, it's just you're there now. So recognizing how to do right against historical wrongs were two examples that I lived through in LA.
Susana, what about you? What advice do you have on this?
Yeah, you know, your question about resilience, I think resilience is hardest when it feels like the failure was inherently personal, and when you are, you know, beating yourself up over mistakes or you know, perceived shortcomings, or because the woulda, coulda, shoulda's that can really magnify the failure. I'm a big believer in the Stoics, and if nothing else, the Stoics teach us that you have no control over the past and you have no control over the future. The only thing that you truly can control is the moment that we are in and how we respond and react to the things that happen to us. And I think that really is at its heart the 2,000-year-old lesson about resilience, because all of the time we spend relitigating the past, or all of the time we spend worrying about what might happen in the future, is at the expense of our ability to truly respond in the moment to what's happening. And it's easy to say that. It can be very challenging to do, especially if it feels like the failure, the poor negotiation, the bad result came at some sort of I should have known. Well, you just got to pick yourself up and move on. Go to therapy if you have to. That's not a joke. And figure it out, because getting stuck in some place, particularly in the past, all of these failures are in the past, and you just can never step in the same river twice. Let it go.
LaTanya?
Yep. So I won't necessarily go into a personal experience for the sake of time, but I do want you to leave here feeling empowered to know that you can build the muscle for negotiation, both personally and professionally, and that it can be the leverage to getting you to your next edge of growth in your career as a woman in leadership. So 3 things I'll leave you with is, the first one is, believe you can win. Before you go into any negotiation, no matter what that negotiation is, because we're talking about big contracts and all that, but look, you're negotiating you're negotiating with your kids. You're negotiating every single day, right? But as women in leadership, oftentimes our biggest failure is when we walk into the room and we're just happy to be there. You should never go into any situation and be happy to be there. You deserve to be there. You're worthy. You're valuable. You have the capabilities. So you got to start with the mindset that you can win, and that you're supposed to be in that seat at the table. And you don't have to kowtow to anyone. You don't have to shrink yourself to fit in that room. You can be bigger than that room if you choose to be. So first is you actually have to believe that you can win in anything that you are negotiating, personally and professionally. The second thing is fail fast, learn faster. Okay? I've failed some negotiations, and small negotiations. Sometimes it's just, wanting to get a policy passed with my board, and I'm counting my votes I'm coming up short here, right? But we learn from those failures. In poker or any game, in sports, oftentimes you win and you celebrate and you never look back at the tape because you got the first place, right? What does the team do when they lose, or the player do when they lose? You're analyzing, you're going back. What did we do wrong? You're weighing it out. If you're playing poker, you're looking at, what's my strategy right? What did that person do that I missed, that I didn't observe? So there's so much to be learned from failure, that you progress in your career and get stronger in negotiation and in all things that you do in terms of skill set when you fail, and learn from that. So that's the second thing. And the third thing I would say that I want you to walk away with as you think about what is next for you and as you consider taking on the next edge of leadership, because you're needed in the space, no matter what space you're in. It doesn't matter if it's government, if it's philanthropy, if it's in the class, in educate the traditional K-12 or higher ed. We need more women leading and learning and changing and understanding that as a single individual, you have the power to effectuate positive change and make a difference. But that only happens if you stay in the game. You can't lose the negotiation, lose the game, and say, I quit, I'm taking my ball, and I'm going home. You have to stay in the game. You get stronger at negotiation the more you do it, the more you practice it, the more experiences that you have. So you fall down, you miss one, you get right back up, and you get in the next game. So those are the three things that I would say. Believe you can win because you're worthy of the positions that you're in and the positions that you aspire to be in. You have everything that it takes. You just have to believe that you're worthy to be there. And then the second one, fail fast, learn faster. And the third one is stay in the game. Put yourselves in the position to effectuate change and to leverage the full capabilities that you possess to make a difference, because your leadership as a strong woman is needed in this country and in every space that's represented in this room.
I'm going to do a quick lightning round, final thought from each of you. What is one piece of advice that you have for everyone here, or one skill that you think everyone here could be doing to start to develop their negotiation skills tomorrow? Susana, why don't we start with you on this?
Yeah, I would say like know your non-negotiables and listen hard for the other people's non-negotiables.
Alberto?
Actually, very similar. And I said it earlier. Know yourself, know your values, define your values, lead with your values into any type of negotiation. Do not be intimidated by the harshness of the opposition, particularly now. Stand strong, never quit. If you fall, dust yourself off, stand up, keep going. Learn from that experience. I really loved what I heard earlier, which I think is terrific advice. Even in the best of wins, there are failures. Always take time to analyze, to do the post-mortem of failure or success, both. A lot of people don't do that. Mm-hmm. They do post-mortem only if you fail. Doing a post-mortem after your success will identify areas where you can be best at still. And the last thing, and I think this is leadership at the moment, I think all of us, regardless of where we are on the political spectrum, are going to be tested. Knowing who you are and having the courage, knowing your why and fighting for it, regardless of consequence, is important. And that, too, is an internal negotiation process that we go through.
Mm-hmm. And then I'll just plus all of that and say and add two things that you heard me say earlier. One is critically important, and I don't think that it should be lost on anyone in this room, especially as we consider all of the data around women in leadership and the need for us to have male allies. Strategic relationship building, I said earlier, I don't want you to miss that. You have to build strategic relationships and trust, because that's going to help you to navigate some of the most challenging situations. It's also going to get you in the room when you don't even know that the room exists. And then the other thing that I would say, and I mentioned this earlier, is negotiating anything, it starts small and then it gets big, right? And so little things you can do now, because you may be negotiating because you want a particular agenda to be pushed, or you want a particular project to go forward, or you're trying to advance a vision, right? So I said earlier, being a debate maker, negotiation isn't always upfront, in your face, I'm being assertive and positing my position. Sometimes it is learning how to be the debate maker to get the discourse started so that opposing views can come to the forefront. But you have to learn that skill of questioning and curiosity and igniting the kind of debate that allows you to get your position up front. So those are two things that I would add to everything that my colleagues have said.
Thank you for joining us, and thank you to all three of you. This is truly a master's class. I hope you're walking out of here with some tangible skills in all of this, and with that sense about what's possible when women possess the kind of negotiation skills, the unwavering belief in their own power, and ultimately are making their own luck. The time for waiting on this is over, and the time is now for women to play the strong hands that they're holding. So thank you.